Hello and welcome back to American Classic Tour TV. I'm your host JD Conroy, and on today's episode we are going off the beaten path to explore 5 kind of hidden or overlooked travel destinations. A few quick announcements before we get into the topic of today's show. First of all, if you've not done so already, if you could hit the red subscribe button which sits just below the right hand corner of this video, we'd really appreciate that. Secondly, if you haven't noticed already, I'm wearing this bright spring colored shirt, and that's because it's a holiday weekend. I'm sure many of you are celebrating Passover or Easter. On behalf of our team here at American Classic Tours, we want to wish you a very happy holiday weekend. On to the topic of today's show. Over the last 4 years, I've led hundreds, if not thousands of travelers all across America. And one thing I've noticed is that oftentimes it's those unexpected parts of our journey that wind up being the highlights. It's that rush of uncovering sort of a hidden gem, discovering something new that I think as travelers we love. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to take you to 5 spots that across America that maybe initially before I went I didn't have the highest expectations for. I didn't know much about these places. But when I got there I was pleasantly surprised. I fell in love. So let's take a look at these destinations. Okay, the first place on our list is Astoria, Oregon, and the first time I had ever been to Astoria was in 2018 when I was leading our Columbia River cruise. And to be honest, before I went on the tour, I hadn't heard much of Astoria. I mean, it's a small town. It has a population of less than 10,000 people, and it sits on the coast of Oregon. Well, when I got there, I was blown away. I fell in love with this little town. If you take a look at a map here, Astoria sits in northern Oregon on the border of Oregon and Washington. If we zoom in, you see that Astoria sits very close or very near to the mouth of the Columbia River, which makes for some amazing scenery, okay, where the beautiful Columbia River meets the big, vast blue ocean. It is really breathtaking. But Astoria is more than just pretty scenery, okay? It has a fascinating history. In 1805, Lewis and Clark and their expedition party, after more than a year of traversing across North America, were making their way down the Columbia River Gorge. And as they were making their way down the Columbia River, and as they neared the mouth of the Columbia River, they started to notice a subtle tide. And I'm sure they looked at one another and were overcome with a feeling of euphoria, knowing that they were about to finally make it. It was just a matter of miles before they reached the Pacific Ocean. And they did, in fact, reach the Pacific Ocean at the mouth of the Columbia River. Unfortunately for Lewis and Clark and the rest of their team, the euphoria did not last long. What they were hoping was that when they arrived at the Pacific Ocean, they'd be picked up by a ship that would bring them home. Well, this turned out not to be the case, okay? So they were stuck in Astoria for the winter of 1805 and 1806, and they spent this brutal winter at Fort Clatsop, which is pictured here, a small log wooden fort, okay? And it was at Fort Clatsop that Meriwether Lewis committed himself to writing in detail about their great expedition west, all the plants and animals they came across, the different Native American tribes they met, and more. Just a few years later, in 1811, Astoria was formally incorporated as a town. It's making it the oldest city in the state of Oregon and the first settlement west of the Rocky Mountains. For much of its history, Astoria has been an important port for both the fishing industry and the lumber industry of the Great Pacific Northwest. Today, Astoria's economy is based mainly off of tourism, a growing art scene, and some light manufacturing. When you visit, you want to make sure you check out the Astoria Column, pictured here. Take a drive across the Astoria-Megler Bridge. And a fun fact, the 1985 hit movie The Goonies was actually filmed and set completely here in Astoria. You can still drive by the Goonies house pictured here while you're in Astoria today. Next up, we have Annapolis, and Annapolis is my favorite small city in the country. There's so much to love about this charming old town. Its historic architecture, its dreamy cobblestone streets, its lovely waterfront, its many up-and-coming restaurants and pubs. After the Revolutionary War and the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Annapolis became the temporary capital of the United States. Congress was in session in the State House from November 26, 1783 to June 3, 1784. And it was in Annapolis on December 23, 1783 that General George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In 1786, delegates from all the states in the Union were invited to come to Annapolis for what would become known as the Annapolis Convention. Okay, only 5 states wound up coming, and the 5 states that came decided they needed everybody there. So they called for a convention the next year in Philadelphia where the Constitution of the United States would eventually be drafted. Annapolis is home to the U.S. Naval Academy, and while you're in town, I definitely encourage you to walk around the Naval Academy's campus. It'll fill you with American pride with its beautiful architecture like that of Bancroft Hall. You can go inside of Dahlgren Hall. Of course, so much neat history to learn here. You can visit the Naval Academy Chapel. And then a few other things to visit while you're in Annapolis. If you have time, I'd take a cruise out on the Chesapeake Bay, which is home to these unique lighthouses called screw pile lighthouses. They sit out in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and they're kind of, oddly photogenic. I'd also encourage you to take walks around the city. Annapolis is a great city to walk, again, with its small cobblestone streets, its charming shops. It's definitely a dreamy sort of place to walk around, especially at night. And lastly, what's a trip to Maryland without trying some of its delicious crab? Next up, we're going to visit Fredericksburg, Texas. Now, if you look at a map here, Fredericksburg sits in central Texas. It's about an hour north of San Antonio and an hour west of Austin. And it's located in Texas's scenic hill country. Fredericksburg was founded in 1846 by a group of German pioneers. They named their town Fredericksburg after Prince Frederick of Prussia. Fredericksburg is famous for being the home of Texas German, a dialect spoken by the first generations of German settlers who initially refused to learn English. You can learn all about this unique history of these German pioneers at Fredericksburg's Pioneer Museum, which is home to countless artifacts and old preserved pioneer buildings. Fredericksburg is also famous for being the hometown of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who led the American war effort in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And because of this, it's home to the National Museum of the Pacific War. Folks, this is one of the best museums in the entire country. It's a museum every American should visit. While you're in Fredericksburg, you're definitely going to want to take a stroll down its charming Main Street, which is home to a number of restaurants, shops, galleries, and some wineries as well. Fredericksburg's in the heart of Texas's growing wine country. The 4th place on our list is Jackson, Wyoming. Now, Jackson is an idyllic or picture-perfect western town. It's located in western Wyoming near the border of Idaho. The town of Jackson was named after the unique land formation upon which it sits, the Jackson Hole, a valley between the Teton Mountain Range and the Gros Ventre Mountain Range in Wyoming. The term Jackson Hole was used by early trappers and mountain men to describe this area, which had these low-lying valleys containing rivers and streams. It was a perfect habitat for beaver, which made it a perfect place for fur trapping. Today, Jackson Hole is home to a charming, upscale western downtown. It's home to a number of shops and lovely western art galleries. While you're in town, I would recommend taking a float trip down the Snake River, taking a gondola ride up to the top of Rendezvous Mountain. There's also a number of ski resorts in Jackson Hole. Or if you just like to enjoy the beautiful scenery, Jackson Hole, like I mentioned, sits right outside of this Grand Teton mountain range. It's perhaps the most picture-perfect mountain range in America, so of course you can just enjoy the scenery as well. The last place on our list is St. Augustine, Florida. If you take a look at the map, you'll see that St. Augustine is located in northeast Florida on America's Atlantic coast. And St. Augustine is a very old city. In fact, it's the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in America. It was founded by the Spanish in 1565. But its history, at least its European history, goes back even further than that. In 1513, in search for the fabled Fountain of Youth, Ponce de Leon, a Spanish explorer, is said to have landed in St. Augustine, Florida. And today, the city still has a Spanish sort of vibe. You can see it in its architecture and in its many Spanish restaurants. An important turning point in St. Augustine's history came in 1883, Henry Flagler, co-founder of the Standard Oil Company with John D. Rockefeller, spent his winter in 1883 in St. Augustine, and he really fell in love with the city. He found it to be very charming. So what he did is he built a railroad all the way from America's northeast all the way down to St. Augustine, so that other wealthy Northeasterners could spend their winters down in St. Augustine with him. Okay, so by 1887, he had already built a few beautiful hotels, and much of the development of St. Augustine, the beautiful buildings that you see today, Henry Flagler was responsible for. And when you're in St. Augustine, you're definitely going to want to visit its famous landmarks, such as the Castillo de San Marcos National Monument. This is a neat fort here in St. Augustine. You're going to want to take a stroll down the charming St. George Street, and you're going to want to drive or walk across the Bridge of Lions. Okay, folks, well, that's it for today's episode of American Classic Tour TV. I hope you enjoyed this virtual tour across America to visit 5 of my favorite off-the-beaten-path destinations. Remember, if you've not done so already, if you could hit that red subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner of this video. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time on American Classic Tour TV.